Number 3. Jeffrey Freeman. Jeffrey Freeman and Martha Cockrell met through work in the mid-1990s in Nashville, Tennessee. They were married in April 1995 after a short courtship. Not long after getting married, Martha started her own business. After the business was established and doing well, Jeffrey was laid off from his job, so he started working at the business. When Jeffrey started coming to the office every day, Martha stopped coming to work as much. Not long after Jeffrey started working with her, Martha started to suffer violent mood swings. She was eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder. On July 4, 2004, Jeffrey and Martha were downtown Nashville and they had gotten a hotel room for the night. Jeffrey decided he was tired and he just wanted to go home. Martha didn't want to go home, so he left her alone at the hotel. After he left, Martha went out walking on the streets of Nashville. She came across Rahiel Rocha Perez and two of his friends. She invited them back to her room, and once there, she had sex with all three men. A month later, Martha decided to move out of the home that she shared with Jeffrey, and she moved into a long-term hotel. 6 months after Martha moved out, Jeffrey was reading the bill from the hotel. He noticed that the bill indicated that 2 people were staying in the room. Jeffrey told Martha that he knew someone else was living in the hotel room with her. He said he wouldn't hold it against her if she just returned home. Martha agreed to move home, and she did so in March 2005, but she slept in a different room than Jeffrey. On April 11, 2005, a neighbor of the Freemans heard some loud pounding on her front door. She opened the door and Martha Freeman walked right by her into her home. Martha blurted out that Jeffrey was dead. The neighbor asked Martha if she called 911, and Martha said no, so she called 911. The neighbor noticed that Martha didn't seem upset. She just seemed indifferent. The police and an ambulance arrived at the Freeman home in minutes. In the master bathroom, they found the body of 44-year-old Jeffrey Freeman. His head was wrapped in a black garbage bag, and his body was in a sleeping bag. His body was cold and rigid. The medical examiner would later determine that Jeffrey had been beaten and strangled to death. As the police were blocking off the crime scene, one of the neighbors approached them, and she said she saw something odd just before they arrived. She saw a Hispanic man running down the road from the Freeman house, and he went into a home that was under construction. The police went into the home and found a man sleeping in the rafters. He was taken out to a police car, and when Martha saw him, she started screaming that was the man who killed her husband. He was identified as 36-year-old Rahiel Rocha Perez, the man Martha met on July 4th. The police searched the Freeman home, and they found an 8x2 storage room. In the room, they found a foam pad, pillows, blankets, 3 loaves of bread, a Nintendo Game Boy, a radio, and several adult magazines, among other items. Martha was brought in for questioning. She told the police that after she moved into the hotel, she had Rocha Perez move into the hotel room with her. Then, when she moved back home with her husband, Rocha Perez came with her. He moved into the 8x2 storage room. Jeffrey had no idea that Rocha Perez was living in his home for about 5 weeks. When Jeffrey was home, he hid in the storage room. Then on the night of April 10th, Jeffrey came home and he heard snoring coming from the storage room. He went to the storage room and found Rocha Perez sleeping. Jeffrey said that he was going to walk the dog and he wanted Rocha Perez out by the time he got home. Martha said that Rocha Perez had different plans. He grabbed a shotgun and waited for Jeffrey to return home. When Jeffrey got home, Rocha Perez led him into the washroom at gunpoint. Martha said she then heard the water running and some loud thuds. When Rocha Perez came out of the bathroom, her husband was dead. But the police had several problems with her story. The first problem was that the autopsy didn't line up with what she said. Jeffrey was probably killed 16 hours before Martha went to her neighbor's home. Martha didn't have an explanation as to why she waited so long to seek out help. During those 16 hours, while her husband was dead in the washroom, Martha went about her life as if nothing was wrong. She walked her dog twice, and she went and picked up a prescription. Jeffrey was killed on a Sunday night, and he called his mother religiously every Sunday at 11 p.m. On that night, Martha called his mother and told her that he was sick and he went to bed. Another aspect of the autopsy that showed that Martha may have been more involved in the crime than she was letting on were the markings on Jeffrey's wrist. While he was still alive, his wrists had been tied behind his back. That suggested that two people were involved in the murder. One person aimed the gun at Jeffrey, and the other person tied him up. Finally, it would have taken two people to move the body around. When they went to trial, Martha's lawyers argued that Rocha Perez killed Jeffrey by himself, while Rocha Perez's lawyer and the district attorney said that Martha blamed Rocha Perez because he was an undocumented immigrant and she thought the police were more likely to believe her over him. Both Martha and Rocha Perez were found guilty and they were sentenced to life in prison. Number 2. Philip Peters. 72-year-old Philip Peters and his wife lived on a quiet street in Denver, Colorado. In September 1941, Mrs. Peters broke her hip and she had to be hospitalized. While she was in the hospital, one of their neighbors was cooking meals for Philip. On October 17th, Philip didn't come to dinner, so the neighbor went to check on him. She found the doors and the windows on his house locked. After looking around, she found a loose screen window and she pried it open. Then a young girl was pushed through the window into the Peters house. What she saw inside is something no child should ever see. Philip Peters had been beaten to death. The police and a doctor arrived on the scene shortly after the body was found. The murder weapons were found at the scene. The 72-year-old man had been pistol whipped and beaten in the head with a cast iron shaker from the fireplace. The doctor noted that he had been struck over a dozen times and several strikes happened after he was dead. The police were baffled by the case. They found Philip's keys inside the house and the house was locked from the inside. They had no idea how the killer got in and out of the home during the middle of the day, and no one noticed. Several weeks later, Mrs. Peters returned home. Because of her health issues, she hired a live-in servant. The servant heard strange noises, and things would move around in the room, even though no one was in the room. Food would also go missing. The servant became convinced that the home was haunted, and she quit. The house became a revolving door for the servants, who would stay for a short time, but then would quit, because like the first servant, they thought the home was haunted. It wasn't long before Mrs. Peters was forced to move in with her son. The house sat empty, but people walking by swore they heard strange noises coming from the house. Other people would see a figure in the window. Enough people noticed strange things happening at the house that the police were contacted. In July 1942, about 10 months after the murder, the police set up surveillance on the home. On July 30th, an officer saw a curtain move and he thought he saw a face in the window. He charged into the house and he heard a door slam upstairs. He ran upstairs and only one door was closed. It led to a closet. He opened the door and saw 2 feet in a small trap door that led to the attic. The officer pulled the man out of the trap door. He was identified as 59-year-old Theodore Konies. Konies was brought into the police station and he told the officers a strange story. Just after Konies was born, his father died suddenly. This deeply affected his mother, and she became worried that he would die as well. As a child, she wouldn't let him play sports, and instead she had him take mandolin lessons. When he was 17, he met the Peters when they saw him play at a club in Denver. The Peters were impressed with him, and they invited him to dine with them. Konies ran into Phillips twice more in the ensuing years, and then Konies moved away from Denver in 1912. Konies drifted to the West Coast, then to the East Coast, and then arrived back in Denver in September 1941. He was homeless and poor when he arrived in Denver, so he decided to pay the Peters a visit to see if they would give him a handout. When he arrived, he found that no one was home, but the door was unlocked, so he let himself in. As he was looking around the home, he saw the trap door and climbed through it. It led to an attic crawl space, and the attic seemed a lot better than being homeless, so he started to live in there. Whenever Philip would leave, he would slip down and get some food. On October 20th, he let himself down and he was raiding the icebox. What he didn't realize was that Philip was just napping and hadn't gone out. Philip caught Konies in the kitchen, and he didn't recognize Konies because he hadn't seen him in decades. Konies attacked Philip, and after killing him, he went back to the attic. The police did notice the door to the attic, but thought it was too small for a person to fit through. Konies managed to fit through the doorway because he was a scrawny man. A newspaper compared him to a scarecrow. While he was compared to a scarecrow, his nickname in the newspapers was the Spider-Man. Konies was convicted of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He died in the prison's hospital on May 16, 1967. Number 1. Fred Oesterreich. On August 22, 1922, the police were called to an upscale neighborhood in Los Angeles, California. 4 gunshots were heard at the home of Fred Oesterreich and his wife Walburga, who went by the name Dolly. When the police arrived, they found Fred shot to death. They found Dolly locked in the closet of the couple's bedroom. The key was on the floor outside the closet, a few feet from the door. Dolly said that a robber came in and forced her into the closet. Dolly looked around the home and said that the only thing missing was her husband's diamond-studded wristwatch. The detective on her case didn't believe her story. Why would a robber break in, kill someone, and only steal a wristwatch? Fred had money in his wallet, but it was untouched. The detective asked Dolly if she and Fred ever fought. She was adamant that they never argued. The detective thought that this was unusual because he knew that every couple fought once in a while. Even though the detective didn't believe Dolly, there wasn't much he could do. He couldn't explain how Dolly got rid of the gun and managed to lock herself in the closet. The detective interviewed some neighbors, but no one saw anything unusual. Several months would go by, and then the detective thought he caught a break in the case. After her husband's murder, Dolly hired a lawyer named Herman Shapiro to settle his estate. It wasn't long before Dolly and Shapiro were dating. The detective then learned that Shapiro was wearing a diamond-studded wristwatch. The detective interviewed Shapiro, and he said that Dolly gave him the watch. Shapiro also admitted that Dolly had given him a .25 caliber handgun. That was the same caliber of gun used to kill Fred. Dolly told him that the gun was not the murder weapon because she didn't kill her husband, but if the police found it, they might think it was the murder weapon. Shapiro believed her, and he tossed the gun into a tar pit. 11 months after her husband was murdered, Dolly was arrested. However, Dolly's lawyer was able to get the charges against her dismissed. After that, the murder of Fred Oesterreich went cold. Over 7 years later, in 1930, Herman Shapiro went to the police because he and Dolly had broken up. They had gotten into a fight over money, and she had threatened him. He then told the police a very strange story. He said that when Dolly was arrested, he had gone to visit her in jail. On one of these visits, she asked for an odd favor. She needed him to take some groceries to her home. When he got there, he was to scratch 3 times on a trap door in the upstairs closet. Shapiro thought it was strange, but he did as he was told. When he scratched on the door, a slender man in his 30s emerged from the attic. He said his name was Otto Sandhuber, and he lived in the attic. He said that he was Dolly's lover, and he had been for years. Shapiro and Dolly's defense attorney convinced Sandhuber that it would be in the best interest of Dolly if he moved out of the attic. The detective who worked on Fred's murder heard about the man in the attic, and he tracked him down. Sandhuber was married, and he was working as a porter in an apartment complex in Los Angeles. The detective brought Sandhuber in for questioning, and he relayed his strange story. He met Dolly in 1903 when he was just 17 years old. He was a repairman at Fred's Apron Factory in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Dolly also worked at the factory. She was the forelady. Eventually, Dolly and Sandhuber's relationship evolved into a sexual one. There are 2 different stories about how they met. The first is that Dolly met Sandhuber at the factory shortly after her and Fred's only child, Raymond, fell ill and died. Sandhuber was about the same age as Raymond. After meeting him at the factory, Dolly stayed home from work, pretending she was ill. She called her husband at work and asked him to send Sandhuber over to their house to fix a sewing machine. When Sandhuber arrived at their home, Dolly was only wearing a robe. As he worked on the sewing machine, she started to reveal more skin. Sandhuber was a virgin, but he knew what Dolly was after. They spent the rest of the afternoon in bed. The other version of the story is that Sandhuber came over to fix Dolly's sewing machine, but they didn't start having sex right away. Instead, Sandhuber became friends with Raymond. Then Raymond fell ill and died. Dolly and Sandhuber found comfort in each other from their grief, and eventually their relationship turned sexual. Regardless of how the relationship started, it continued on for 3 years, with Sandhuber coming over when Fred left the home. One neighbor saw Sandhuber coming and going, and they told Fred. Fred asked Dolly about it, and she said that the neighbor must be crazy. That was too close of a call for Dolly, so she hatched a new plan. She asked Sandhuber if he wanted to move into her attic. Whenever Fred wasn't home, they could be together. Amazingly, 20-year-old Sandhuber agreed. He wanted to be a writer, and he planned to use his time in the attic to write. So Sandhuber moved in one day while Fred was at work. When Fred was gone, Sandhuber roamed the house and he even cleaned up and he did chores. When Fred was home, he hid in the attic and wrote. He gave his handwritten short stories to Dolly, who typed them up and sent them to publishers. As the months became years, Sandhuber started to get his short stories published. Fred was supposedly a heavy drinker, and this could explain why he didn't seem to notice that a young man was living in his attic. But he did come close to discovering Sandhuber a few times. Dolly had put a padlock on the attic door, and she was the only one who had the key. She said she kept her furs in the attic, and she wanted to protect them. Fred did find it strange that she would unlock the attic when they left the house together and lock it whenever he was home. One night while in bed, Fred swore he heard a man clearing his throat in the attic. Another time, Fred and Dolly were outside working on the garden. Fred looked up at the attic window and swore he saw the face of a man. Fred was also sure that food was going missing. Dolly told Fred that he was crazy and convinced him that he was just seeing things, so he never looked in the attic. Over the span of 6 years, Fred and Dolly moved twice. Dolly insisted that the houses had to have spacious attics. When Fred and Dolly moved, Sandhuber moved with them without Fred realizing he was there. By 1918, Sandhuber had been living in Fred and Dolly's attic for 11 years. One evening, Fred and Dolly were out at a party. They got into an argument, and Fred came home early and alone. When he walked into the kitchen, he found Sandhuber helping himself to some food. Fred threw Sandhuber out of the house, thinking he just broke in and not realizing that the man lived in his attic. After that incident, Dolly suggested that Sandhuber move out to Los Angeles, and he agreed. However, Dolly couldn't stay away from her lover for very long, and she eventually convinced Fred to move to Los Angeles. They spent several weeks looking for a home. The problem was that the type of attic that Dolly wanted wasn't common in homes in Los Angeles. They finally found one and moved in. It wasn't long before Sandhuber moved in as well. By August 22, 1922, Sandhuber had lived near continuously in Fred and Dolly's attic for 15 years. On that night, the couple came home and they were arguing. Dolly slipped on a rug, and Sandhuber thought that Fred had gotten violent with her. He let himself out of the attic, and he grabbed a .25 caliber handgun. He then went and confronted Fred. Fred apparently recognized him as the man he caught stealing food back in Milwaukee. Fred supposedly attacked Sandhuber, which caused the gun to fire, and the bullet entered Fred's chest. Sandhuber then fired 2 more bullets into his lover's husband. Fred Oesterreich was shot twice in the chest and once in the head. Afterwards, he put Dolly in the closet and locked it. He took the watch and the gun and ran to the attic. When Dolly moved to another house after her husband's murder, Sandhuber moved as well, and he continued to live in her attic. They felt that after the murder, he had even more reason to hide, because if someone found out about him, they'd know he was the one who killed Fred. After Sandhuber confessed, both he and Dolly were arrested. They went to trial nearly 10 years after the murder. Sandhuber was found guilty of manslaughter, but the statute of limitations had run out, so he walked out of the courtroom a free man. Where he went and what happened to him after he left the courtroom is unknown. Dolly's jury couldn't reach a verdict, and the charges against her were dismissed. In 1961, Dolly got married a second time, and she was living in a room above a garage. Less than 2 weeks after getting married, she passed away. She was 75 years old. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you liked it, please subscribe for more videos just like it. Please don't forget to visit criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases and buy merchandise. Please also check out our Patreon page where you can get access to an exclusive podcast. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.